Alhamdulillah nahmaduhu wa nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruh. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, my good friends, and welcome to another discussion on YouTube. I'm going to tackle the issue of sectarianism and sects, and what I want to share with you is the following. Number one, I want to look at the main differences, the main sects, or the way in which Islam became divided. And then secondly, I want to look at the reason, or the conditions that gave rise to those differences. So let's first look at the key differences. You get different sects in Islam, not only as far as what we commonly refer to as fiqh. Fiqh would normally, for the ordinary Muslim, refer to the way that you perform your daily salah, the way that you conduct your personal, religious observances, interpersonal law. And many people would assume that those are the areas that mazhab or sects are confined to. But in fact, sects are also in other areas of the religion of Islam. Now, an important area where you find different sects is the area of core doctrine, or aqidah, the basic core doctrines of a Muslim. And we know that in a Christian church, the idea of orthodoxy is extremely important. And very, very early on, the Christian church made a point, especially the Catholic Church, of roping in any deviant idea. And so it was very important for the Christian church, or for the Roman Catholic Church, to preserve its own orthodoxy, in other words, its core doctrines, and not to allow any deviation from those. Islam never really had that problem, but in say about 150 to 250 years, there was an attempt to create an orthodoxy. Now, orthodoxy is to freeze the basic core doctrines and to disallow or to prevent any further elaboration or further development or new insights into those core doctrines. And the Muslims, within about 250 years, developed an orthodoxy of its own, a Catholicism, as it were, of its own. And it didn't happen early. It never happened in the time of the Prophet. The Prophet never mentioned the idea of an orthodoxy. The Quran, in fact, is simple enough. All the basic core doctrines that were required were contained in the Quran. And those core doctrines would be the existence of God, the nature of God as a singular creator, without any partner, without any equivalent, or whatever other form of association you can make. So that is very clear. That's the core doctrine of Islam. So it's absolute monotheism. The second core doctrine is the prophecy, the prophethood of the Prophet Muhammad and of a series of prophets that preceded him. Another core doctrine would be the existence of the final day of judgment and the resurrection that will precede that judgment. Then there would be core doctrines such as to accept or to affirm the existence of supernatural or transcendent creatures such as angels. And I think there are maybe some more, but those are the core doctrines that are contained in the Holy Book. And so those were always sufficient. But within about 250 years of the demise of the Prophet, then an additional bunch of doctrines were developed or came about. And the need for these core doctrines obviously was that the doctrines contained in the Quran no longer could provide sufficient answers to the public, to the general populace. And there was a need to reconcile. Now, you know, the difference between scholarship and scholasticism. Scholasticism is the practice of bridging the assumed theological positions and doctrines with the rational observance and experience of people. That's a mouthful. But let me just go over that slowly. Scholasticism is the practice of bridging and of ameliorating, so making acceptable or improving in the minds of people and making sense in the minds of people of their core doctrines, the assumed core doctrines, and reality that people are experiencing. You see, so let's say, for example, if you believe that there's the original sin, and all people are born into sin. That is a doctrine of the Christian church. And you come with somebody who questions that, and they say, look, but how can a baby have sin? Then the practice of scholasticism would then invent words and arguments and philosophies that would ameliorate, that would bridge that gap, that would make it palatable, that would make the assertion, the religious or the theological or the doctrinal assertion or assumption, that would make it palatable and fathomable. And so that is really the reason for scholasticism. And with the Quran and the core doctrines that the Quran displayed or contained, there was no need, because the Quran generally does not need scholasticism. The Quran admits of reason. So, for example, we don't have the original sin in the Quran. We don't have the Trinity in the Quran. We don't have the idea that God could punish good people and send good people to hell who have been obedient to his instructions. You don't have in the book any assertion or any direction or directive that instructs people with something that is completely at odds with their rational faculties. And so that is the reason why there was no need really for scholasticism. So I'm just putting that down as a sort of a introduction. So let me just go to the main differences. So what we know is that there are in fact differences. There are sects, but I'm not going to look at the sects of Salah and fasting and what time you're supposed to make Salatul Asr and what time you're supposed to, and where you're supposed to keep your arms dangling on the side or folded on your stomach or on your navel, or whether it should be above your navel. Now, I'm not going to look at those nonsensical sectarian issues. What I want to look at are the basic core doctrinal differences. And I'm going to pull out two of the very early scholarly sects or doctrinal sects or sects of Aqidah, schools of Aqidah, of core doctrines. One of the very earliest school of thought that is in fact probably the first school of thought after the passing of the Prophet was the rationalist school of thought. Now, the rationalist school of thought was known by the term the Mu'tazila, and the Mu'tazila refers to those who have it refers generally to those who use rational reasoning and logic and Aristotelian logic and whatever forms of logic and reasoning, whether it's empirical arguments or induction or deductive logic, whatever. The idea of the rationalists was that you need the Quran and you need a sane, healthy, rational mind, and that is what you need to get to the law or to the ideas, to build knowledge and to increase understanding. So the rationalists had a very clear idea about justice of Allah also. So the rationalists, the Mu'tazila, also believe that Allah is just, and it is impossible for Allah or for God not to be just. So in fact, that is an assumption, and a core doctrine within the rationalist school is that God is of necessity just. God is not able to break a promise, or to intentionally, or to lie, or to mislead, or to deceive, or to dupe people into burning in hell or whatever. So those things are core doctrines of the rationalist school. So the problem, now I said earlier to you that when people experience a disjuncture, when they experience a lack of consistency between reality and the core doctrines, then there's a need for a development of the core doctrine. Then there's a need for a proliferation of new core doctrines and new ideas and new, religious theological positions and doctrines. And that is exactly what happened. The Sunni or the Ash'ari theological school or school of Aqidah is, of course, a development from the rationalist school. So there was the rationalist school originally. Famous name that you can associate with that is Wasil ibn Atta, but you can also associate all the family of the Prophet with it. The son-in-law, the grandsons, the great-grandsons, the Ja'fari, Imam Ja'far Sadiq, the Zayd, Imam Zayd, whatever. All the Ahlul Bayt were in fact rationalists. And so you find a new kid on the block emerging around about 150 years after the passing of the Prophet. And that new, or say 200 years, is called the Ash'ari. That new doctrinal school is called the Ash'ari school. And that school departs from the basic teachings of the Mu'tazila. How does it depart? First of all, it disputes the idea that God is of necessity just. So in other words, it abandons that assumption. It says that God can be just or can be unjust if he so chooses, which goes completely or flies in the face of the rationalist school. So nobody can in fact assume justice on the side of God. That is the first thing. The second difference, where it departs radically from the Mu'tazila, and I didn't mention this with the Mu'tazila, but the Mu'tazila also always believed that man has 100% agency. In other words, power of choice, power of decision. And that God does not share in the least bit in that power of choice. So that's a core doctrine of the Mu'tazila, right? So we've got the justice of God, we've got absolute independent agency. So what the Ash'ari then does is, the new school founded by a man by the name of Ash'ari, and also by another man called Maturidi. What they do is they then also bring in a new doctrine called the shared decision making. So they bring in the idea that every decision and every action of man is partially by his own power or volition, but also partially shared by the will of God. So the change then is that God shares in your actions and decision making. So yeah, the question then is, you have the old school, you have the rationalist school, and now you have new ideas, new doctrines that come in. Of course, there were many new doctrines that came in the years to follow what is called Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'at, also brought in the idea of technical infallibility of the Sahaba. You know, technically it amounts to infallibility, because the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, it's a doctrine that you are not legally or permitted to question or to criticize any member of the 120,000 people that saw and interacted with the Prophet and died as Muslims. So many core doctrines that came in. They also added doctrines such as the status of Jesus Christ, you know, the existence of punishment in the grave, and so the Ahl Sunnah piled on a whole lot of doctrines on top of the very few core doctrines that the Quran is. There's no position in the Quran on punishment in the grave, but Ahl Sunnah, you know, founders and developers of that Aqidah added more beliefs around Jesus and around the grave and around the Sahaba and around, you know, the rightly guided Sahaba, and that you are allowed to add the Sunnah of the rightly guided Sahaba is on a par with the Sunnah of the Prophet. Yeah. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that why was there a need to elaborate or to proliferate new core doctrines after the initial simplicity of the Aqidah? The Aqidah was very simple: one God, unique, singular, you know, end of days, day of judgment, end of time, you know, the prophethood. Why was there a need? And why there was a need is very simple. The people experienced a disjuncture between what they saw in the Quran, in other words, justice of God, and what they saw in reality. What they saw in reality was that the kings who had usurped the rulership, the office of government, that they had usurped the state, be they the Umayyads or the Abbasid kings, because these were the two early dynasties that ruled. They found these two dynasties to be at odds with the Quran. So, for example, you would get the Umayyads being as evil as you can imagine, killing, stealing, every conceivable act of corruption, killing en masse people, you know, killing the grandson of the Prophet, for example. And the people had to ask, you know, but is that not an injustice? And so the scholars had to come, you know, and explain that justice is not as simple as you think it is, and God is not necessarily just. And you now have to manufacture and produce Aqidah and doctrines to make the evil seem palatable. Do you understand? Why doctrines had to prefer and be elaborated. And so when people ask the question, but you know, the king is ruling, but the king is doing all these evil things and so on, mustn't we punish the king? And then the scholars for dollars would come and say, no, but the king is not deciding on his own. What he's deciding is actually shared by what God is doing. So he's not really solely responsible for his actions. So you can't blame him. You know, Allah, a common phrase I hear locally is Allah puts out. Allah has set it out. And when you ever have traveled to the Middle East, you will hear the word in Egypt, ma'alish. And it means simply, it's not on you. It's never mind. It's okay. You know, it's the will of Allah. it's the will of Allah. And they will say inshallah for everything, right? Inshallah is fine. We do, that is etiquette, that's the way we speak, because the bigger picture, the way the world will shape itself in the future is all in the taqdeer of Allah. But the decision making of man is his own. So what has happened is these core doctrines have completely messed up the Muslims' idea of what is just. So now they have to assume that the king can be unjust. Their own personal responsibility, they now have to assume that if they don't really have responsibility, the devil can make me do it. Allah made me do it. And they can blame Allah for your crimes, in fact. So that is my explanation of how sectarianism, or how sects came about. The first sect, of course, and the biggest one. Why is it the biggest one? Why are most Muslims Ahli Sunnah wal Jama'at? Why? Why are most Christians Catholic? Simply because the government endorsed it and embraced it. The king endorsed and embraced it. You know, if you go to Saudi Arabia now, you will find most people belong to the school of thought that was preached and taught by Ibn Abdul Wahhab, and in fact the Wahhabi view of Islam. Why? Simply because the state, the government of Saudi Arabia, has made it the official doctrine, or the official theological position. Why are most people in Iran Shia? Not because there was a natural progression towards it. No, in the 1500s, the king, the Shah, the Safavid king in Iran made it the official religion and enforced it on the country. Right or wrong? But that is the history. I'm just giving you the history. So why are most people in the world Ahli Sunnah wal Jama'at? Simply because the Abbasid kings, and then the Turkish sultans, and then all the other kings and rulers that came after them, the Mamluks and the Seljuk Turks, and all these different groups, and you know, the sultans or the caliphs of Andalusia, they all embraced the Ahli Sunnah core doctrines, and that is why it became popular, because they could fund the scholars, and the scholars would write these books, and these books would become the official state orthodoxy. It's nothing magically beautiful or right about it. In fact, some of the Ahli Sunnah wal Jama'at teachings go directly against the Quran. The Quran, if you study the Quran, there's no way in the Quran we ever will say that Allah or God can punish a good, pious person. But in the Sunni understand, Ahli Sunnah, they accommodate the possibility that a pious person may in fact be punished, just because God might feel like doing it. So to summarize and to conclude, we unfortunately are stuck with these doctrines that have been produced by scholars for dollars, that have served the dynasties and the kings and the rulers. And these doctrines have got absolutely no basis in the Quran. So what happened is people have discovered and other literature that have no basis in the Quran to prop up these false doctrines. You see? So then you find a hadith like Sahabi kan nujum. My companions are all like the stars, by whichever one you decide to navigate, you will arrive at your destination. Nonsense. Absolute nonsense. It's not nonsense. It does not make sense. And so we have to reject this. We have to, those of us who are serious, you know, there are those few hundred of you that will watch this. We have to dismiss this as nonsense and proceed to look at the Quran from a rational perspective and then plot a healthy way forward if we are ever to liberate ourselves from this mess that we find ourselves in. And I think I've just given you just a basic understanding which we could explore more in future. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.